They thought he was crazy for befriending a bear. Until this happened, they described him as crazy. He wouldn't last a week, they claimed. A friend who is a wild bear? Not possible. However, Jim Carter was indifferent to their opinions. He put everything on the line, including his reputation and safety, to demonstrate that some ties are stronger than fear. People labeled him reckless, warned him, and laughed at him, until the day that everything was different. The world was stunned by what transpired next. You'll want to watch this through to the finish, I promise. Jim Carter was unique, and not just another man living in the woods. He was attracted to wild animals, particularly one that would permanently alter his life when most people were afraid of them. It began as a strange meeting in the middle of Alaska's wilderness, but what transpired was completely illogical. The bear studied him, almost as if studying him rather than attacking. While most would have fled, Jim refused to back down. He drew nearer every day, creating a connection that nobody thought was possible. He was making friends with a wild animal rather than taming it. Jim demonstrated that sometimes the strongest friendships are the most unexpected, while the rest of the world watched in shock. But when he thought nothing could break their connection, an unthinkable event put everything at risk. Then, however, an unexpected event occurred. Jim believed he had gained the bear's full trust, but then things took a perilous turn. For a minute, they strolled through the forest in peace, just as they had done innumerable times before. A bunch of hunters then materialized, their weapons lifted, their gazes fixed on Bruno. They saw him as a threat rather than a friend. Jim had a few seconds to make up his mind. Would he risk everything to save the bear that had become like family? Or would he just watch his best friend become a target? Even the hunters were shocked by what transpired next, which permanently altered the course of events. You won't want to miss this story. What began as an incredible friendship quickly became a life-or-death situation that would push the boundaries of bravery, devotion, and trust. Jim was doubted by others, who told him that he was making a fatal error. But what transpired in that fateful moment left everyone stunned. Keep reading, because the way this narrative develops will make you reevaluate everything you believe to be true about the relationship between people and wild animals. Jim Carter wasn't your typical person. He saw the forest as home, whereas others saw it as something to be conquered or feared. He was attracted to the wild beauty of nature at an early age, and preferred the companionship of animals to the cacophony of society. He studied wildlife habits, learned to read the land like a second language, and hiked through impenetrable forests for many hours. Jim believed that the wild was misinterpreted and not threatening. However, nothing in his years of travel could have prepared him for the day he encountered a huge brown bear that would transform his life into something more than a wild beast. He was going to be a friend. The Alaskan wilderness is a place of unadulterated wild beauty, where rivers sculpt their way through the rocky landscape. Towering pine trees reach the horizon indefinitely, and the only sounds that break the stillness are the rustle of invisible creatures in the underbrush, or the distant cry of an eagle. The earth is governed by nature, with harsh winters, short summers, and a constant struggle for existence for both humans and animals. One mistake might spell the difference between life and death in this vast and unpredictable world. For Jim Carter, however, this was home. not just a wild and deadly place. He appreciated the animals who called the area their home, knew the routes like the back of his hand, and was aware of its rhythm. However, as he traveled farther into the forest one fateful morning, he discovered something unexpected that would contradict all of his preconceived notions about the wild. Jim's boots crunched over fallen leaves as he followed a familiar track when he suddenly felt it, that distinct feeling of being watched. He came to a halt, breathing more slowly as he looked around at the woods. Then he saw it, just past a clearing, a huge brown bear. Its deep black eyes were fixed on him as it stood still, partially concealed by the tall pines. This was more than just a quick sight of a bear moving by. The animal was not frightened or hostile. It was just observing, examining him. Jim was aware of the rules. Don't move abruptly. Don't ever turn around. A bear will never be lenient. However, something about this particular moment felt strange. There was no show of dominance, no bluff attack, no roaring. Nothing but quiet. Man and beast, predator and outsider, stared at one another for what seemed like an eternity. Then Jim did the unimaginable in a moment that went against all his instincts. He took a tiny step forward rather than retreating. The bear remained still. One more step. Nothing, though. Then, for reasons Jim was unable to fully explain, he spoke quietly. "Are you sure you're not scared of me?" He spoke steadily and cautiously. The bear only blinked and cocked its head in an apparent attempt to comprehend. Jim realized right once that this bear was not like the others, and it would soon grow into something much more. It would turn into Bruno. All of Jim's instincts told him to turn around and go. Anyone with basic sense would do it. However, he felt compelled to stay. He remained still. He didn't recoil. He just held his ground, staring at the enormous bear in front of him. Then, unbelievably, something occurred. The bear did something that no one would anticipate from a wild predator. Instead of rushing, growling, or even displaying the smallest hint of aggressiveness, it moved forward slowly and deliberately, curiosity rather than assault mode. As it got closer to them, its enormous paws hardly made a sound against the woodland floor. Jim's heart was racing. This was the moment when everything could go wrong, and he knew it with all his heart. Nevertheless, he remained still. He just waited, without making any noise or reaching for a weapon. Then, in an illogical moment, the bear did something that left Jim speechless. It took a seat. It was there, a few feet away, sinking into the ground like a huge, unconcerned dog. Jim let out a sigh that was audible in the clear air. There was no standoff here. This was not a conflict. There was something else about this. He was not viewing a wild bear as a threat for the first time in his life. Additionally, the bear was not viewing a human as an enemy for the first time in its life. At that moment, they exchanged an unspoken message. Jim realized that this would not be their final meeting after that day. Weeks went by, and Jim started seeing the bear more frequently than was normal. He initially believed it to be a coincidence because bears wandered freely in Alaska's vast forests. However, it became more difficult to ignore the more it occurred. Bruno was always there, observing from afar whenever Jim went hiking. He would occasionally stand at the edge of a clearing, perch on a rock, or follow the same paths as if he were a silent friend. Initially, the bear remained at a distance, watching Jim as Jim watched him. But gradually, that gap started to close. Bruno wouldn't run, and Jim would pause. Bruno wouldn't back down when Jim took a step forward. There was a silent understanding between them, no signals of fear or animosity. Jim then decided to push the boundaries of their peculiar bond one day. He brought food as an offering, not a trap or bait. Fresh from the river, a fish rested peacefully on a flat rock, where Bruno frequently showed up. He had low expectations. The bear could choose to ignore it. Perhaps it would steal the food and vanish. However, Jim was caught completely off guard by what transpired next. Instead, Bruno moved cautiously forward, neither lunging nor seizing the food. He took a whiff of the air, looked at Jim, and then took the fish slowly and deliberately. It was almost like trust, but not with the crazed desperation of a scavenger. Their interactions took on a new dimension after that. Bruno was starting to become a familiar fixture and an expected part of Jim's daily excursions. He was no longer just another wild bear. The enormous predator that ought to have posed a threat had changed completely. The bear seems to have reached a decision to remain, a decision to believe in. By doing this, he and Jim develop an untruthful friendship. Jim wasn't sure at first whether Bruno actually knew him or if the bear just put up with him. However, things began to shift with time. Jim started bringing modest offerings, such as fruit he had foraged, fresh fish from the river, and even the rare slice of bread. He never tried to approach the bear too closely or coerced it into taking them. Every time, he would just leave the food in the same location and observe from a safe distance. Initially, Bruno was wary. He would take a whiff of the air, look at Jim, and then come closer. But the hesitancy gradually subsided, as though he was starting to realize that Jim wasn't a threat. The bear began eating without fear, and occasionally even lingered afterward. Jim seemed to study Bruno as intently as Bruno studied him. He was able to decipher the bear's body language, including its deep huffing sounds, which were not growls but rather a means of communication, the slow blinks that indicated composure, and the way his ears twitched when something drew his attention. Bruno was far smarter than most people thought bears were. Then Jim realized that they had created something uncommon: trust. On one particular day, Jim did not take the usual step back after setting a fresh fish on the rock. He just waited, standing there. After a brief period of hesitation, Bruno took an unexpected action. While Jim was still a few feet away, he took the fish instead of retreating. It was an understanding, a tacit pact between them. Jim was no longer merely a person traveling through the world. He was unique. The bear had made up its mind. It could tear through trees and overwhelm anything in its way. He had decided to put his faith in Jim. Jim had also made a decision in return. He was seeing more than a savage animal. The world thought he was bonding with an untamable beast. It was one of those cold mornings when the forest floor was covered in mist, adding to the sense of mystery. By this point, Jim was used to Bruno's presence. He was no longer as tense as he had been when the bear was close. However, something occurred on this specific day that convinced Jim that Bruno was different from other wild bears. Jim had started his typical journey, following the same meandering paths inside the forest. He thought Bruno would be around, but as he was walking, he became aware of an oddity. The bear wasn't only following along or observing from afar. He was walking next to Jim, not in a predatory manner, not as though he was pursuing him, but rather as though he was going with him, like a friend, not a savage. Jim came to a stop. So did Bruno. Jim stepped forward. Bruno trailed behind. Then Jim did something unexpected. He sat down on a big boulder in the middle of the trail to test a thought that had been growing inside of him for weeks. He had doubts about Bruno's actions. Would he go? Would he venture into the forest like any other bear? Bruno, however, stayed put. Rather, the enormous bear did something that no one would have believed unless they witnessed it firsthand. He took a seat a few feet away as well, nearly exactly imitating Jim's motions. Jim's throat tightened with breath. Bears don't usually act like this. A human and a wild bear did not sit side by side as friends or equals. There was more to this than a creature putting up with his presence. Bruno then gave a deep, quiet huff, which Jim had learnt was a sign of comfort and serenity rather than a growl or threat, as if to validate Jim's beliefs. The bear was letting people know that it was here. I have faith in you. That's when Jim realized it. Bruno wasn't your average untamed bear. He wasn't impulsive, and he wasn't only motivated by his gut. A bear that had chosen trust over fear was something far rarer, and Jim felt certain that this connection was genuine. As news of Jim's strange connection to Bruno grew, locals began to pay attention. They initially believed it to be only a harmless tale, one of those man and nature stories that would eventually be forgotten. However, the responses swiftly shifted when Jim candidly declared that he could walk fearlessly with a wild bear. The first people to express their concerns were his neighbors. One said, "Jim, you're playing with fire. What happens if that bear decides you're not friendly, even though it may seem friendly right now?" Some were even more direct. "Jim, it's not a pet. It is a predator. You will come to regret this one day." Jim could relate to their fear. He was aware that his actions contradicted all of the knowledge that mankind had gained about wild animals. However, he was also aware that Bruno wasn't behaving like a typical bear, something they were unaware of. This attraction wasn't limited to one side. Over time, a mutual trust had developed. However, the outcry intensified when wildlife specialists learned about it. Conservationists and biologists began to comment, cautioning that Jim's connections might have harmful repercussions. One expert informed him, "You're messing with nature. This bear could become dangerous to you and everyone else if it becomes overly at ease around people." The police even contemplated intervening. There were discussions about moving Bruno and implementing regulations that would stop Jim from maintaining his peculiar connection. A bear so used to human interaction would eventually need to be put down, according to some. Jim found it hard to believe. The trust they had developed, which was what made Bruno unique, was now being used as an excuse to keep them apart. Jim, however, had no intention of giving up. He had spent too much time with Bruno and had witnessed too much knowledge and intelligence in the bear's eyes to think that this was only an instinctive, wild animal. He sensed in his heart that something was coming, something that would definitively demonstrate the existence of this link. The responses grew more vocal and more severe as Jim's story circulated beyond of his little town. People now made fun of him rather than merely questioning his behavior. His name became a byword for carelessness on social media, in news articles, and even in casual talks at the neighborhood diner. "That guy is out of his mind. He's going to end up on the news for all the wrong reasons. You can't befriend a wild bear. This is a disaster waiting to happen. Even the internet was terrible. Articles and videos about him have comment sections full of memes, jokes, and cautions. He was referred to as foolish by most but valiant by others. The notion of a person befriending a predatory wild animal, people couldn't handle it. However, criticism wasn't limited to outsiders. Those with years of expertise studying creatures like Bruno, known as wildlife experts, came out against Jim's actions. In an interview, a biologist informed him, "You're interfering with nature." There's a reason why bears are crazy. What occurs if this bear becomes at ease with the wrong person? When it wanders into the wrong town in search of food? Jim, you're not just endangering yourself. You're also endangering the bear's life. Others noted that it was rarely successful to teach a wild animal to trust people. It wouldn't matter how kind Bruno had been to Jim if he ever came too close to the wrong person or showed up in the wrong place. Instead of taking a chance, authorities would put him down. Jim listened to everything. The doubts, the insults, the warnings. He knew why people had those feelings. He was aware of the dangers. However, nobody appeared to realize that this wasn't solely his choice. He had also been picked by Bruno. Jim wasn't trying to control a bear by feeding it. He was not intruding into its domain. Day after day, week after week, Bruno continued to return. His behavior was not that of a dangerous predator. He was behaving like a friend, and Jim was prepared to take any chances to demonstrate the validity of this relationship. However, no amount of discussion or caution could get him ready for what was going to happen next, because Jim and Bruno's relationship will eventually be put to the ultimate test, and everyone on the planet would be observing. As Jim's story became more widely known, things became more serious. The authorities were now becoming engaged, so it wasn't just rumors from neighbors or expert critique. Wildlife officials began keeping an eye on the area because they were worried that a bear that was so at ease with people would endanger people. They warned Jim that Bruno's presence near town could result in deadly confrontations, citing rules of wildlife protection. The conversation turned from worry to action, with suggestions of moving Bruno to a distant location, far from Jim and other people. Some even implied that euthanasia might be the only option if Bruno came to pose a threat. Jim was furious. He had spent months getting to know Bruno, gaining his confidence, and demonstrating that the bear posed no harm. Bruno was just living in the only house he had ever known. He wasn't straying into towns or frightening people. "You don't understand," Jim protested when he was questioned by officials. "This bear poses no threat. No one has ever been attacked by him. He knows me, so he's not behaving like some erratic predator. He has faith in me." However, their answer was stern and icy. "Jim, bears don't have pals. He will eventually act out of impulse, and someone will be harmed as a result." Jim wouldn't take it. Nobody knew Bruno as well as he did. He had sensed the compassion in his presence and seen the intellect in his eyes. This was a link that went against everything people believed to be true about nature, not just a wild animal pursuing food. Jim refused to back down. The issue is not Bruno. People are afraid of... He was aware of the dangers. He was aware of the cautions. However, he was also aware that true trust could not be described in words. To be believed, it had to be seen. And before long, an event would occur that would compel everyone, including the authorities, to acknowledge the reality. It was one of those calm afternoons when the woodland seemed unaltered and the air was silent. Bruno was not far behind Jim as he hiked his customary route, which he had taken countless times. By this point, their friendship had practically become second nature. Bruno followed him at a steady pace, never being too close or too far away, always alert and constantly observing. Then, however, everything was different. The silence was broken by a distant rustling. Jim initially believed it to be simply another animal scuttling through the undergrowth. However, his heart fell when he glanced ahead. A hunter's group. They had weapons slung over their shoulders and were camouflaged, standing only a few yards away. Everything changed suddenly when they noticed the enormous bear behind Jim. Their casual conversation came to an end. They stiffened. Instinctively, their hands went to their firearms. "Bear!" exclaimed one of them. Jim's heartbeat quickened. He saw the horror in their eyes as they fixed Bruno, not with admiration or interest. They did not consider Bruno a friend. He posed a danger, a trophy, a kill. Jim was hardly able to think. With their fingers straining toward their triggers, the hunters had already raised their weapons. Jim shouted, "Stop!" and threw himself between them and Bruno, his arms outstretched. Startled by the abrupt interruption, the hunters froze. "Are you crazy? That thing could tear you to pieces," exclaimed one of them. Jim remained still. Despite his racing heart, he spoke steadily. "No, he won't. He's not like other bears, therefore you don't get it." The hunters looked at each other. They believed him to be insane. Bear assaults were nothing new to them. They were aware of the potential of untamed animals. Nevertheless, this man appeared to be defending it by standing in front of one. Another hunter cocked his weapon and yelled, "Move aside, buddy. That object is too near people. It's an issue." Jim has his hands clenched. After everything, he wasn't going to stand by and let them murder Bruno. However, before he could continue, something occurred that rendered everyone incoherent. Bruno moved to the front, not violently, not out of fear, simply as though he knew what was going on. Subsequently, in an unexpected moment, he took a seat. Bruno sat in the center of the clearing like a huge, serene sentinel, his enormous body looming over Jim, but showing no signs of danger. When his deep brown eyes met the hunters, he was patient rather than angry or hostile. "I am not your enemy," he seemed to be saying. Jim spoke quietly but firmly as he turned back to the hunters. "Observe him. Do you think he's dangerous?" There was silence for a long time. The hunters were staring at something that defied their expectations after being certain they were up against a ferocious, unpredictable beast. There was no attack from the bear. The bear did not run. A bear was listening. Slowly, one of the hunters brought his weapon down. He whispered, "I've never seen anything like this." The others came one after the other. Although the tension in the air subsided, Jim was aware of how near catastrophe they had been. Everything might have turned out differently with one poor decision and one frantic response. However, Bruno had decided, and he had just saved his own life by doing so. Jim just had time to act, not time to ponder. He was aware that one mistake could be Bruno's demise as the hunters clutched their rifles, their fingers aching for the triggers. Jim moved immediately to put himself between them and the beast. "You're going to have to go through me if you want to shoot him," he whispered, his voice firm despite the panic tearing at his chest. Hunters paused. "Get moving, dude. That bear is crazy," yelled one of them. Jim yelled back, "He's not a threat. You don't understand. He's not like other bears." The tension was oppressive. Jim wasn't moving, and the hunters weren't retreating. For a brief while, the whole forest seemed to be holding its breath, anticipating what would come next. Then Bruno moved before anyone could respond. Jim tensed up. He thought the bear would bolt, perhaps even defend itself. Everyone was stunned by what transpired next, though. Bruno didn't snarl. He did not make a charge. He didn't behave like a savage animal about to engage in combat. He lowered his enormous head and gave Jim's shoulder a light tap, a slow, methodical motion. He nearly seemed to be comforting him. The hunters stopped. Their hands lingered over their weapons, but their gazes were fixed on the impossibility before them. A mature, untamed brown bear displaying trust rather than violence. Bruno then sat down as though to emphasize his point even further. He sank into the dirt there, right in front of the folks who thought he was a monster, and let out a deep, low huff that Jim had learned to symbolize peace. "I am not your enemy," he seemed to be saying. The jungle was quiet. Hunters exchanged glances, their faces changing from one of resolve to one of uncertainty. One of them lowered his firearm and whispered, "I've never seen anything like this." Others came slowly, one after the other. Their rifles' barrels fell. The air became less tense. Jim's heart continued to race as he turned to face Bruno. No scientist, expert, or regular person would have ever believed what this bear, this wild bear, had just done. He'd rescued himself, with trust, instead of violence. More quickly than Jim could have predicted, word got out about what had transpired in the forest. At first, the only talk in town was about him standing between armed hunters and a wild bear. Some felt he was lucky to be alive, while others labeled him insane. The story, however, took on a life of its own when one of the hunters related what they had seen, how Bruno had opted for trust rather than violence. News organizations reported on it. The man who befriended a bear and, unbelievable, a wild bear's remarkable act of trust were among the headlines. Reactions were all over social media, with some people incredulous, and some still doubtful. Those who had earlier made fun of Jim were now changing their minds. Then the experts arrived, the same wildlife specialists who had told Jim that he was disrupting the natural order. In an interview, a biologist acknowledged, "We've never seen a bond like this before. Everything we know about bear behavior tells us this shouldn't be possible." One of Jim's harshest critics, another specialist, had a change of heart. Feeding a wild animal till it develops dependence is not the situation here. This bear is making decisions. It's reacting to Jim in a way that contradicts our preconceived notions about social relationships and animal intellect. After being resolved to get rid of Bruno, the authorities encountered an issue. When a bear isn't acting like a wild bear, how do you move it? Given that he has never acted aggressively and that he ought the opportunity to attack, but opted for peace, how can you defend taking him away? In the end, it was decided that Bruno would remain. No one would intrude as long as he was out of town and in the wilderness. Life went on. Bruno and Jim continued to follow the same paths. The same clearings still brought them together. They continued to have private moments of comprehension that no one else could completely comprehend. They were more than just a man and a bear now, though. They were legendary. Jim was irresponsible, according to some, that no rational person would take the risk he did, that he was fortunate Bruno didn't betray him. Others, however, have a different perspective. They witness a man who followed his gut, who saw above prejudice and fear, and who demonstrated that often the most meaningful friendships are the ones we least expect. What do you think, then? Did Jim demonstrate that there is more to these animals than we have been taught? Or was he naive for putting his trust in a wild bear? Please share your ideas in the comments section below. Please remember to hit the notification bell to ensure you never miss a new upload, like the video, and subscribe for more amazing true stories if you liked this one. I appreciate you viewing, and I hope to see you in the future one.